essentially a posting of what's going on in the city. And it is items that you would expect to read about.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, it's the type of stuff you'd expect to see the next month after, not 6 months later.
Hi, welcome. I've got a printed out our presenters' slides, so we'll want to follow along.
That'd be great.
Because they had meeting house in the total library.
Just so you know, we will take questions at the end, and
Yeah.
we're broadcasting live on YouTube, so that the audience can hear you. I have to use the microphone. Just so you know.
Push through the occupancy permit, even though it's like restoration or something. The structure is resolved, not the city permit.
So I'm saying good afternoon from a very windy Arkansas. Nice. There's, see these folks here, but there's also 21 people watching already.
For the aliens.
Oh,
3 minutes? Thank you. Myself to you. I made a big mistake last night of drinking hot cocoa before going to bed, and apparently had a lot of caffeine in it. So.
If she falls asleep at the podium, I'll make sure we're on.
That's okay.
Just.
I have the same problem. I found my great-grandfather in Canada last night about 10:30, so I didn't.
And then
get
you,
to bed
yeah,
till-
then you got
till
all
about
excited.
1:30.
Oh, that's so cool. Were you on Ancestry or?
No, on University of Montreal database.
Oh, okay.
They're taking the Druin records,
Okay. Yeah.
and they've been digitized, like, so they're on Ancestry, but they're just copies of the handwriting. They're taking up the people, linking all the people together, and then putting that in a clean database.
Oh,
With
okay.
links
Yeah,
to the-
yeah, rewriting it, transcript. Yeah, so then it makes it searchable.
Yeah, well, the other one's searchable, but it's not verified, where this is actually a group that says, okay, if this is the father, and here's the mother, and there's the daughter, and then this daughter is the same daughter that gets married 20 years later.
They're verifying that?
You know, they're making all those lineages.
That's nice.
Yeah.
I'm just going to be up here waiting for us to get the cue from Shanae, and she'll let me know when we're about to start. I think we have about a minute or so, and then we'll begin our presentation.
But that was yes.
I'm going to read your entire biography so they know all about you. So, just tell me one more minute.
Marie, Louise Marie Trudeau
Okay, those are the.
had, had grandma, well, actually, her grandma was back at that time, but
Okay,
she
but
married Messner.
Yeah.
And then,
But what was the deal with, is that, the Trudeau, that couple that immigrated, or is it kind of separate?
I think they came in together.
Okay.
I think they were,
So it's the same as my UK and CD together.
Okay, welcome. to today's National Archives Know Your Records program. My name is Andrea Bassing-Matney. I'm so pleased that you're here with us today, be it if you're here in Washington, D.C. or watching on YouTube. We welcome all of you. Before we begin our presentation, I have a few tips I'd like to share with you on how to participate. For those of you who are in the audience with us in Washington, D.C. in the McGowan Theater, we'll take your questions at the end of the program. We just ask that you use the microphone in the aisle, please. And I think all of you have our handouts. So for those of you who are watching on YouTube, we will also take your questions if you're watching us live. You just log into the chat section of this YouTube webpage and type in your question, and I will take that question and ask our presenter for you again at the end. You'll find two links on this webpage, one to live captioning, and the other one will take you to the handout, which is our presenter's presentation slides. So today's program is entitled Accidental Genealogy. We will begin learning about various genealogy sources from Ray Bottorff Jr. as he describes valuable information accidentally found in our records, including records regarding military permissions to marry, deceased military personnel, and military personnel passenger lists. This is a two-part series. Now about our presenter. Mr. Bottorff joined the National Archives in 2010 as a National Archives technician and worked in the research and microfilm rooms at the National Archives in Washington, D.C. Then in 2013, he transferred to the textual processing section in College Park, Maryland, and later became an archivist in 2014. Ray's hometown is Detroit, where he spent 20 years in various customer service roles for Guardian Alarm and Chrysler Financial. He graduated with a Bachelor of Fine Arts in Drawing in 1990 and earned a Master's of Arts in History, along with a Certificate of Archival Administration in 2009 from Wayne State University in Detroit. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming our presenter, Ray Bottorff Jr.
And thank you, Andrea. I appreciate that. Well, welcome. As Andrea introduced already, my name is Ray Bottorff Jr., and I am here today to talk to you about a little bit about kind of records I discovered while working in textual processing at Archives 02, actually. And to get couple things, some housekeeping out of the way. When I refer to Archives 2, I'm actually referring to the National Archives building in College Park, as well as when I refer to Archives 1 or A1, I am referring to the National Archives building here in Washington, D.C. that we're broadcasting from. Also, a couple other things I'm going to show up in the slides here to kind of give you an idea of what I'm referring to. I'm also going to refer to things like National Archives identifier numbers, and you'll see a lot of them in the slides. You use those numbers to actually pull up and locate the information in the online catalog at archives.gov. So you go to our website to type in that number and the record information will pull up. Also too, I'm going to refer to things called record groups. Record groups are basically the main cluster of information that we use to categorize records based on the agency or the organization, military or otherwise, those records belong to. It helps us organize our records better. And I welcome you to this presentation. And how we got here, Andrea kind of covered a little bit about this and how we got here, at least how I got here anyways. The National Archives, I joined the National Archives in 2010, and one of the things about working here at the archives here downtown was that you had to kind of learn real quick how to do genealogical work. The main thrust of a lot of the things that happen around here are related to genealogical research, and so you kind of have to learn a little bit of what's going on. And one of the things that we are trained in is to study our own family history, which I kind of learned to do pretty deeply and enjoyed very much. Now, as it turned out, though, when I moved to textual processing, that information didn't quite disappear from my memory. I carried it with me, and as I'm working at College Park and going through records, I would stumble across stuff all the time that I would say, geez, the genealogists, if they only knew about this, they would be very happy to want to look through it and see what they could find if any of their relatives show up in these records. Pretty much, if you are going to do research in these records, this is a more complex knowledge base. It's basically your next step in researching. You really need to have your basics out of the way before you do any of this research, and that includes the usual suspects: census, family oral histories, military records, birth records, marriage records, death records. Knowing this information ahead of time will enable you to help know what records to look in for when you go to Archives 2 and doing your research there. And there's several questions you should probably ask even before you even get out there to even find out if it's worth your while to even research these records. Did your ancestor work for the federal government, for example? Did they own or play an important part in a business that did work for the federal government or was affected substantially by federal regulations? Did they serve in the military? If so, what, where, and when did they serve? Did they correspond with the federal government or to their local members of Congress in any fashion? And did they register with the Selective Service during World War II? I'm going to get to the Selective Service records tomorrow, but one of the first things I did, though, when I started putting together this presentation is to find out from my fellow compatriots I worked with at A2 what stuff they've run across, because no matter how much stuff I saw, I didn't see everything there. And what kind of things that they thought that maybe genealogists probably should be aware of that's out there at that location. And, well, here's some of the records that they discovered during their time there. Record Group 59, that's your general records of the State Department, includes records relating to application and recommendations for public office. As it turned out, the State Department, for about the first 100 years of this country's history, handled all applications for people looking for employment with the federal government. They did all the checks and everything and all the hiring, and they maintained the records of that. And you can go through those records to determine if any of your family members actually applied for any positions within the federal government. And Record Group 84, which is a sub-series, I guess you'd say, for the State Department. This is, in this case, the Foreign Service Posts of the Department of State. And basically, these are records related to consular activity and embassies. And you may find records in those records related to things like overseas marriages and divorces regarding American citizens. In this case, I'm giving an example of these general records pertaining to marriage and divorces, which record series taking place from 1943 to 1946, contains the files regarding marriage and divorce records as reported by the U.S. Consulate in Ciudad Juarez, Mexico. And if you speak with an archivist who's a reference archivist at A2, it is highly recommended that you definitely inquire about what other records in other places of the world that might also fall within this category. There is more than likely much more than just this one particular record set. There's also the issue of court-martial records, and not everybody's ancestor, unfortunately, did the right thing during the course of the military service, and all military branches did keep records of court-martials. In this case, the Court of Inquiry proceedings under Record Group 125, the records of the Office of the Judge Advocate General of the Navy, covers really a good chunk of the 20th century and gives greatly detailed records of Navy court-martials. And there are similar such records available for the Air Force, for the Army, and other portions of the military branches. The United States also, over the years, accumulated records from its activities overseas. And Record Group 466, the records of the U.S. High Commission in Germany, and include records related to children resettlement and case files involving children's resettlements. And these records contain the files involving children who were orphaned or separated from their families due to the Second World War, and the attempts made by this group to find family or find adoptions for them. You can find those records here in that particular series. Record Group 242 is the National Archives collection of foreign records seized. And when the war was over, the United States did seize a lot of material from the defeated powers during World War II. And in this case, the records are a set of records from the Luftkommandos. I'm sorry if I mispronounced that. That's basically a number of various German Air Force commands concerning U.S., British, and other Allied air crews, records that they maintained Many of these records are in German, but they include some English, and the English translations. American created materials are also related to these records, are added in with the records as well. Materials regarding downed air crew. Some files even include items like pictures taken away from air crews by the German captors. Of all people, General John J. Pershing, his record collection here is also available here at the National Archives. And General Pershing kept a pretty detailed set of records, including also his own set of records related to court-martials. And the list of officers, soldiers, and others convicted by general court-martial in the American Expeditionary Forces. Since we are nearing the 100th anniversary of America's entry into the First World War, this might be of interest for folks to search and see if any of their family members were convicted by a general court-martial during the course of the First World War. There have been some other records found in record group number 92, the Office of the Quartermaster General. There are what they call missing aircrew reports found in that series. There are also editorial reports involving Vietnam War-era officers documenting their service. There is also after-action reports, which details the events that took place during some sort of military action. And often at the end of those reports, there would be a casualty report that you can refer back to as well. Like all records, it is highly recommended that you speak with a reference archivist when you come and visit. Basically, this will allow you to help narrow down your selection a little bit. A lot of times they will have finding aids and other materials available to help you narrow down to what particular boxes that you need to look at, so that way you're not going through dozens and dozens of boxes just to find a little bit of material. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about something called keywords, I call, and these are basically items that kind of go across multiple different agencies and series of records that you can kind of look up for and try to find. And this will allow you to kind of look out for certain things that you may not normally look out for in records that may not automatically identify themselves as having potentially genealogical material. And in particular, I'm going to start off with special orders, or they also sometimes called general orders. And they're pretty much orders that are issued across all branches of the armed forces. Those records issued before 1964 could serve as a substitute to service records that would have normally been found at the National Personnel Record Center in St. Louis, but were destroyed in the 1973 fire there. In the case of general orders, or as they would later be called, G-series special orders, are often records of awards being given to military personnel, and are usually of great interest to people searching their ancestors' military history. Now, there are some matters with special orders that researchers should be aware of, especially when searching the Air Force in particular. Basically, beyond the awards giving, there are other types of special orders that were issued by the military. This includes orders relating to assignments, movements, leaves of absences, other duties involving service personnel. Typically, as it turns out, particularly with the Air Force, those records created before 1964 are permanent, and after 1965 are temporary. And all temporary records will eventually be destroyed. They're not meant to be kept permanently. In theory, the information in these temporary records are already recorded in the service records in St. Louis, in theory. It's probably not a bad idea to check to make sure that. Sometimes information can sometimes get lost. A lot of these temporary records don't make it to the National Archives. They're held and disposed of after their time period has passed. But if for some reason these records have made their way to the National Archives, you can still view them as long as they're in our possession. They can be requested by researchers, but keep in mind that a lot of these records are fairly of a recent variety from the 60s and 70s and 80s. So therefore, they may require some measure of screening and maybe even possible redaction of personal information such as Social Security numbers. As Social Security numbers you will find in a lot of military documents from the 60s through the 90s were used as a primary identifier of soldiers, and as a result, because of problems of having that information out to the public, not readily available to people. So it's possible you might be able to view these records, but you may not be allowed to copy them, photocopy them anyways. You can record the information on it, but not copy the Social Security numbers. there's another key word to look out for, and that is congressional correspondence. And what makes this different from the records that you find here for the Center of Legislative Archives here at Archives 1, that basically the Center of Legislative Archives handles records involving the workings of Congress, such as legislative work, committee proceedings, and they may include correspondence, but usually stuff that goes right directly to Congress, not so much stuff involving the other agencies, not as much. Congressional correspondence records at A2 usually relate to members of Congress interacting with or interceding on behalf of a constituent and their matters involving other government agencies or the military. They are organized within records of that agency or armed service, so that means that you have to actually physically look out for the word correspondence or look out for the word congressional correspondence in the records. And so you may want to ask yourself, did your ancestor have a penchant for writing letters to their congressman? If they did, then perhaps maybe it might not be too bad of a thing to look out for. You will find that really since World War II, Congress's correspondence with government agencies and armed forces were saved pretty heavily. And if you search through those records, you may just find something. And I'll show you an example of one that I found was kind of amusing, actually. Usually such correspondence begins with the constituent, either an individual or someone on behalf of a business. They send a letter to the member of Congress about the problem they have. And this one here I found in Record Group 462, which is in the records of the Food and Nutrition Service, and correspondence for the fiscal year of 1981. And what you have here is a letter from Judy Hebring of the National Buffalo Association. And she is writing to Senator George McGovern. Basically, what her letter states is that the association is having a problem with the imports of water buffalo meat coming in and identified itself as buffalo meat. And it's not, as far as the association is concerned, pure buffalo meats. Actual buffalo meat is American buffalo, or better known as bison, as she points out. And she's afraid that this inferior product will somehow confuse consumers with the superior American product. So the good senator, taking care of his constituent, decides to get involved. And he writes a letter to the Secretary of the Department of Agriculture. And basically, usually what happens is that information gets sent to whoever the designated person in that particular agency to receive, along with a copy of the original correspondence. And then at that point, it's received by the agency and handled accordingly. In this case, the Secretary of Agriculture forwarded it to the Food and Nutrition Service. And in this case, the Food and Nutrition Service punted it. They didn't really do anything about it. Basically, their resolution of the matter was that it was not their matter. This is something that had to be dealt with by the Food and Drug Administration. We had nothing to do with this. So sometimes these correspondence does not necessarily lead to an answer, but maybe to lead to somebody else that might have an answer. And so if you end up hunting this particular person, you may have to go to the Food and Drug Administration correspondence records to find out if there was any resolution to this matter whatsoever. You find congressional correspondence records in pretty much just about every agency in some way, shape, or form. And it's kind of worth it, particularly if that person that you know and your family member had interaction with that agency. There's a good chance that those records might show up. I'm going to talk about a little bit bigger subject, the War Department Decimal Classification Manual. And this is the manual that was used to organize military records in the Army and the Air Force and other military commands during the course of, really from almost all the 20th century until it was replaced in the 1960s. And basically it's a manual in which tells you where your records needed to go, what decimal classification it belonged to. And there's two particular ones that are related to genealogical research that folks can keep an eye out for when they are running into decimal records. One is decimal 291, and in particular, well, 291 in this case is listed as genealogy and race, but 291.1 is related to marriages by members of the military. For those who have served in the military who wanted to get married, the military often required permission to get married. And in a lot of those record groups, you will find the permission to marriage records show up. In decimal 293, these are records of funerals, burials, and reports regarding deceased individuals. And this information is on personnel who died in service or the interment of transportation or reinterment or recovery of deceased military personnel. Basically, what happens to the deceased service personnel's bodies, either being buried or their funerals and so forth. That information might be of interest to genealogists as well. I'm going to talk first about 291.1. In Record Group 495, which is the United States Army Forces of the Western Pacific during World War II, these are the folks that kind of followed up behind MacArthur as he was doing his campaign through the Solomon Islands and the New Guinea and the Philippines. In particular, the series that was originally called General Correspondence, but it's now called Correspondence, related to memorandums, orders, permissions to marry, and general records. This series I ran across included records involving marriage records, and mostly involving, of all people, the Philippine Scouts, requesting marriages to fellow Filipinas. They also include Americans who want to marry Filipinas, and some Americans wishing to marry other fellow Americans, and some Americans wishing to marry Australians. These records run the gamut pretty much the entire war period and the immediate after-war period. And I'm going to kind of tell you a little bit of a story involving one couple and their efforts to get married. And I want you to meet the good folks here who are looking to get married. This is, I'm going to mispronounce this way. This is Mr. Albolas and Ms. Gore. And Ms. Coral? Yeah, Ms. Coral. Basically, under this classification, the personnel looking to receive permission to marry had to go through a rather lengthy investigation process. Excuse me. First, there's an investigation of all the parties involved, and they want to find out everything about them, their home condition, their financial standing, and their reputation, whether they're considered, good reputation as far as the community is concerned. And the funny thing is that even though the Philippines became independent in 1946, the Philippine Scouts were still under the auspices of the United States Army, so they still had to go through all this, even though they were an independent nation, at least through 1947, from what I found. Through that investigation process, basically you see where it's okay. We'll get things started here. It's been approved by the commander, and they deem it to have a reasonable chance of success, and will not become a public charge, is what they initially determined. But it's basically this hasn't stopped yet. There's still more work to be done by these good folks who are trying to get married, and they have to. One of the things they have to do is they have to obtain permission of the next of kin. And so in this case, the spouse's father gives the okay to the marriage. He's fine with it. And so he fills it out. So the nice thing about this genealogy is that now you're discovering more of the family just by these good folks trying to get married. The spouse's mother is out to also give the okay as well. Once again, another branch in the family tree is filled in by these records as well. The groom has to give an affidavit of a statement of intentions, and basically, he agrees that the marriage is real and that he has followed all the rules for it. He's basically being a good soldier and doing what he is supposed to do, and he's signing off on it. Now, sometimes folks have to get married for the usual reasons, and that is pregnancy. And so in that case, there's a separate part of the form that's filled in that says that, yes, this marriage is a result of pregnancy. The military apparently gave that a pretty good reason enough to get married, I guess. And so they, in this case, this particular American soldier who's getting married to a Filipina had to notate that that's the reason for their marriage. And he had to go through all the other stuff too and sign off on things. In this case, I did, just for the heck of it, look up on Ancestry to see what happened to him. And sure enough, about 6 months later or so, you could find them on the ship passenger records for San Francisco. So they did make it stateside as husband and wife. What happened after that? Hopefully someone will fill it in some other time. Now, of course, the wife also has got to do a statement too as well. And in her statement, she's listing the parents' information, education, her occupation, her religion, her age, and her home address. Sort of a little bit of everything about somebody in the Philippines. And I've been to the Philippines, and sometimes these home addresses are, they're their shacks, basically. So it can be kind of interesting to see this information about where these folks lived during this course of time. But wait, they're not dead. They're not done yet, because they still have to submit their marriage application. And here's the actual marriage application as it was submitted to the military. And of course, the chaplain's got to get involved, because he too also interviews to make sure these folks are reasonable, that they have a reasonable success for getting married, and he's got to sign off on it too as well. And then finally, after going through all that, they're finally given their permission to marry by their commanders. And so hopefully they didn't give up on the whole thing and end up getting married after all. These records also kind of give the horrors of World War II a little bit as well. Widows and widowers had to show proof of their spouse's death, and this kind of shows the sadness that happened in the Philippine Islands during the course of the Japanese occupation. One's an affidavit, the other one's a proof of death from a local register. And basically what you have here on the left is the widower who lost his wife to tuberculosis, TB, during the early stages of the Japanese occupation in 1942, a condition that could have been totally treated even then, but nonetheless she passed away from it. The widow, in this particular example on the right, lost her husband due to mass executions done by the Japanese due to military operations taking place nearby by Philippine and American forces during the landings in the Philippines. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the record classification number 293 from the same record group that we talked about before. And this one involves the identification of deceased individuals. What you have here is an example of a body of a pilot that was found and located, but they couldn't figure out who this was. And so the job of these particular folks were to figure out who this was. And what they did was that they collected the information about approximately when this took place, interviewed locals, also garnered as much information they could together about the plane itself, in particular the part information on the types of parts that were on the vehicle and what kind of plane it was. With that information, and then they're able to backtrack through their records to find out that it did match up with a particular airman, in this case, Second Lieutenant Francis Ford, who had died on a mission over the Philippines in early '45. And so this also kind of gives kind of the backstory a little bit and how this from this record group and how these soldiers are found and information garnered about their whereabouts so they can be properly buried or sent back home to their family. Now, I'm going to talk about the last record group I'm going to talk about today is record group number 336, which is the records of the Office of the Chief of Transportation, or is better known as the Transportation Corps. It primarily dealt with the moving of equipment and supplies and arms and other items, but it also moved service personnel, both alive and dead. And basically they maintain their own version of passenger list records, tracking the movement of armed service personnel from overseas military installations to the United States. Here's an example of a front page of an Articles of Agreement between the ship's master and seaman and the Transportation Corps, outlining the transportation and care of military personnel in that vehicle. Now, for those who have ever looked at passenger list records, this looks kind of familiar, vaguely familiar, because you'll see something similar to this on the front of every passenger ship manifest list. In this case, from the Central Decimal Files, this particular record comes from. And if you actually look, it gets even more eerie. If you actually look at the actual particulars of engagement, this is a passenger list for all intents and purposes. It looks just like it. It lists the names of the passengers, their signatures sometimes, they're signing off on things, their physical descriptions, their country of origin, their rank, wages, next of kin. It also lists 70-year-old Social Security numbers, so they probably have to be, unfortunately, redacted if they're still viable. But they look exactly just like a passenger list. Now, they also had other types of passenger lists, too, as well. And they had their own version of passenger lists for aircraft flights. And here is an example from the classified central subject decimal files. Basically, they're cover sheets, and you can see from them they basically, there's an immediate cover sheet following by outlining the flight information and the special orders that authorize the flight. When we get past the cover sheet, then right there is the flight's passenger list. And what is interesting is you can see about this particular list, it not only lists the service personnel that were on that particular flight, but as a sign of the times, you can see they also listed separately African American personnel, little asterisks saying for those folks who were African American. I'm assuming because of various segregation laws in the United States. They came over on one airplane, but probably were still segregated as well. There is also a decimal classification within the Transportation Corps that might be of interest if you run across it. It's decimal number 580. And this is small craft crew reports next of kin lists. And they kept track, basically, of those who were on small crafts and their next of kin in case something happened to that small craft. Found in the central decimal files of 49-1950. They include information such as the traveler's country of origin, his height, his age, and the names and addresses of his next of kin. Here's a cover sheet and how on those particular records, and it basically lists the ship, the date, and the port of embarkation. And here's the actual crew listing next of kin list, and it's once again you see it right here. Personnel, name and rank, country they're from, height and age, next of kin and their address. Basically, a lot of information that you will find on nowhere else, pretty much, and not too many other military records. And you look up something like this. This is a good, and there's a lot of pages of these sort of records that could be used by genealogists to find information on their relatives who served overseas in the immediate war and Korean War period. They also maintain records called marine insurance agreements. Here found in the subject files series in the Transportation Corps. And basically these were insurance that was offered as payouts to sailors and to their beneficiaries in case of their death and or lost property while at sea. It contains information on the deceased seaman, including the casualty date, name of the vessel, and the name and addresses of the person's beneficiary. And here's a list of payouts made, and as you can see, date of casualty, name of ship, seaman's name, the beneficiary name, amount received. Keep in mind, this is not necessarily military. This also involves merchant marine folks, too, as well. In particular, I want to point out the last ship at the bottom listed there, the Cynthia Olson, which, as you notice, the date of sinking is kind of important, December the 7th, 1941. And the reason why I mentioned the Cynthia Olson is because it had kind of an interesting backstory. It was bringing, on that date, it was bringing timber from Portland to Hawaii to help build military facilities. And on December the 7th, the ship was stopped by a Japanese submarine, and the entire crew was forced into lifeboats in the North Pacific. The submarine then sunk the ship, leaving the crew floating in the ocean. Their SOS was forgotten during the chaos of that day and the subsequent days thereafter, and pretty much the entire crew died at sea. When you listen to Franklin Roosevelt's Day of Infamy speech, he talks about ships being sunk on the high seas. This is one of those ships. And here, this particular list here is the listing of the crew members of whom the benefits were issued for. Now I'm going to talk about the repatriation files. This is a pretty significant set of records within this particular record group. The Transportation Corps was heavily involved in the repatriation of war dead from the European, North African, and Pacific grave sites to American grave sites post-World War II in the Central General Administrative and Repatriation files. You'll find that these records look very much like passenger list records, but instead they're lists of the deceased. And they include the name of the vessel transporting the remains, names and ranks of the deceased service personnel, along with the date of port departure. And also, as this was going on, the Korean War broke out, so they had to also keep track of the Korean War dead coming back home. And here's the cover and certification pages. Looks very familiar to the previous ones that we examined before, including certification sign off and things. And here is what the deceased passenger list looks like, the one on the left. It's basically listing the service personnel and his rank and other related military information, along with the departure information. For the case of smaller repatriation efforts, you might get one like the one on the right, where it's a combination of the certification as well as the two service personnel that were being repatriated back to the United States. And here's an example of the Korean War dead. These records were originally, of course, classified primarily because the war was still going on. They've long since been unclassified, but you also kind of get like a real-time effort of the war dead returning home from Korea here through these records. Now, the last item I am going to talk about today is a rather unusual set of records that can be found within the Transportation Corps, and these are the records involving the railroad strike of 1951. And the funny thing is about the post-war period after World War II, during the war, unions across the board pretty much agreed to not strike. And after the war, they began to strike with vengeance to try to gain greater wages and greater benefits. And the Truman administration dealt with a lot of major strikes during the course of his administration and reacted accordingly when he felt that national security was involved. And during January and February of 1951, there was a nationwide railroad strike that basically threatened to shut down the entire nation's transportation industry. You have to keep in mind, railroads were the primary source of transportation of goods and services in the country. We had not had the federal highway system into effect yet, and so trucking had not quite taken over as much as it is today. So it was very important. Not only that, it was the middle of winter, and most people still relied on coal shipments to be able to heat their homes, and this was a serious problem, something I'm sure the unions involved knew full well that they could work towards getting their demands met by striking when they did. But President Truman decided, well, no, he was going to place the Transportation Corps in charge of the nation's railroad, basically declaring it an illegal strike. And basically what the Transportation Corps did was not only run things during the course of the strike, but they also collected things like sign-in sheets, crew lists, and seniority rosters from nearly every single railroad across the country to eventually use in a lawsuit against the strikers and their unions. Whether it was actually used or not, I could not tell you, but the records were maintained and kept and forwarded to the National Archives. And in an odd sort of way, at least for railroad workers, this kind of serves as a bit of a preview for the 1950 census, because when you pull up this information, and here's an example from the Southern Railway System, a daily register, all the people who signed in that day who were basically firemen and trainmen. You also get stuff like, here's a seniority roster of switchmen from the Fort Worth and Denver City Railway Company. Nice listing of all those particular switchmen, including their seniority dates when they were hired for the railroad. And you can see it again here. There's another example of a seniority roster. This one's from Manufacturers Railway Company. You can see the variety in each one of these rosters depending on the railroad. And in particular, some lists are longer than others. This particular list marked off those folks who quit, which basically said, no, I am not working for you anymore. This one's a crew list for the Chicago Junction Railway Service, and it includes home addresses as well for of the personnel involved in the railroad. I want to thank you all for coming here. That's my last bit of my presentation, and tomorrow we will do the one on selective service, which I'll go into greater detail. And pretty much, I want to thank you all for being here. Thank you all for watching. And if you have any questions, please feel free to ask me. And by the way, there will be a bonus answers if anyone can guess what two movies those last two slides are from. And I thank you.
Thank you, Ray, very much. You're going to hear clunk, I think, because I'm turn on my microphone. Hello. This is Andrea. So at this point, I see one question at least from our online audience, from Dana Kessler. She had an uncle that was in Iceland and got married to a local. So she is wondering if there's also a set of records for Europe and Atlantic marriages from World War II.
There's a possibility. A lot of these records were maintained. I myself did not run across any records related to anything related to European marriages, but the military kept track of all that stuff. It was part of the military, part of the rules and regulations of the military at the time. So you probably expect that if the records were saved, the archives probably, considering the time period, probably does have them. I really recommend probably checking our catalog and kind of looking for records that relate to the military in Iceland. And I would definitely inquire with reference archivists and see if they know of any records that may contain those particular kind of marriage information. In particular, keep an eye out for the decimal numbers because the stuff would be organized by decimal. So you want to look out especially for any records that says decimal records.
Fantastic. Thank you for that answer. Do we have any questions from our audience that's sitting here in the room with me? If you do, we ask that you use the microphone so we can capture your voice for our online audience. Let's see, I do have another question that's popped up from our online audience. Phyllis Hunt wants to know, where would I find more information regarding a cousin missing in the Korean conflict?
Missing in action records. I would definitely talk to a military archivist, reference archivist at Archives 2. Either write in or inquire about them. There should be records related to prisoner of war or missing in action personnel. What kind of records those will be, they'll be able to pinpoint better than I can. I would definitely inquire with them, either come here and visit in person, or if you're not able to do that, you can do that through the mails as well. They might be able to direct you towards some records that might be able to help you better.
Thank you, Ray. Are there any questions from our online audience? If not, Ray will be back with us tomorrow, so give me a moment. I'm going to make my way up to the front of the stage. Ray, I want to thank you for your presentation today. Thank you for joining us. I want to remind everybody that all of our presentations are recorded and remain online on the YouTube webpage. We have a Know Your Records playlist, and all of the presentation materials are there for you to download. So Ray will be returning tomorrow. Do you want to do your slides, see if anybody can guess?
Oh yeah, would anyone like to take a stab at what to, going back here, this is the previous one. Let's see here, there we go. It's a Michael J. Fox movie, if that helps any. Maybe the, almost.
Wasn't that it?
Well, it was, but there's a part to it. Part 2, yep.
He said Back to the Future.
Yeah,
Yes.
part 2, yep. And this one gives me a way of what kind of materials I enjoy collecting. This comes from the Batman Forever movie, the question mark from the Riddler.
So thank you, everybody, for joining us today. I hope that you can come back tomorrow. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Fantastic. We had several people who were on.